Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Tonight's talk is sponsored by the College Scholars Program. This program provides a stipend to JCC faculty, both full and part-time, for the development of 2 research presentations, and either a guest lecture in another instructor's classroom or a faculty seminar on the topic of their choice. College Scholars was started by Dr. Jim Leiker to provide a platform for JCC faculty to present their research projects. Those of us who are involved in this program feel it's important for a number of reasons. First and most importantly, it gives community college professors a chance to do research, which is tough to do because community college professors are teachers first and foremost. But doing outside research also makes us better teachers because we can bring new material and new enthusiasm to the classroom and to our students. And then finally, I think this College Scholars Program is a wonderful way for the community to see what an asset it has in JCC, and for us to interact with members of the community and to share what we're doing with all of you. So, on to tonight's speaker. Deb Williams is a lifelong learner whose interests and degrees range across the curriculum. She holds advanced degrees in law, counseling, biology, and philosophy, and she is right now adding Indigenous studies and anthropology to that list. Since 2006, she has been a prominent member of JCCC's faculty, serving in numerous leadership positions, including president of the Faculty Association, chair of the Department in Environmental Science, and faculty advisor to a number of student clubs. She has also received many awards in her time here for excellence in teaching and service, including this award. This is the 3rd time she's been our college scholar. She has published and lectured on topics such as sustainability, wolf ecology, medical ethics, and Kansas ecology. And finally, she is a world traveler who has been on safari in Africa, has seen a kangaroo preserve in Australia, embarked on a nearly 200-mile pilgrimage in Spain, and drove 9,000 miles from Kansas to the Northwest Territories in Canada. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Deb Williams.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. I feel like I need to certainly thank Sarah for her warm introduction and also thank you all for being here tonight. I also think it's important to acknowledge how very vital this College Scholar Program is from the faculty's perspective. So as a 3rd-time recipient of this award and this opportunity, I can't emphasize enough how valuable it is to the faculty member and hopefully informative to the public at large, because these presentations are made available to the public to kind of showcase the research and interests of the faculty here at JCCC. I think I'll just go ahead and jump into my presentation. As you can see, bundles, pipes, and mounds exploring nearby Indigenous cultural sites. What I'm doing to hopefully do for you tonight, I'm going to serve as your interpreter or your guide to these nearby cultural sites, kind of give you a heads up of what you can see. And the plan is to illustrate that within only a day's drive, you can see these really interesting, Indigenous cultural research sites and enriching ecological sites. And so sometimes I think we don't understand how fortunate we are living in Kansas, how close we are, to resources not only within our own state, but nearby, only a day away. Some of you have been with me, throughout this 3-lecture journey that started on November 21st with a very specific kind of talk about the sacred pipe, spiritual, cultural, and political significance of Calumet ceremonies among the Plains Indians. This morning, I presented sort of a more generalized research talk, traditional ecological knowledge, Indigenous perspectives on environmental problem solving, and then this capstone experience is to really showcase what started it all, what inspired it all, which is these real interesting visits to nearby cultural sites. They all were tied, just created as a package, if you will. And so those of you who've been with me for all three events maybe have a better glimpse into what was in my mind when I developed them. But bundles, pipes, and mounds. So I'll jump right in to this story. Hopefully you had a chance to pick up, I created a brochure which may be helpful to you if you decide, if I inspire you to go to some of these sites. It might be handy to take this along with you, or at least read about what I have to say after and process maybe what you might experience. So in terms of the bundles part, the Pawnee Indian Museum in Republic, Kansas is the site that I'll feature tonight. And what you see featured here is the Pawnee Sacred Bundle, which I'll have several slides to discuss here when we get to that section. Pipes, Pipestone National Monument in Pipestone, Minnesota. This was, as I refer to it in my presentation, it all started with an intriguing day trip. And what you can see up front, by the way, I forgot to mention, there's some literature at the front table, and there are some pipes, some jewelry, some necklaces, and other objects that's been crafted with pipestone. If you get close enough to me, I'm wearing pipestone jewelry, earrings, and a necklace. So it's very interesting material for a lot of reasons, and very special material to Native Americans, which is part of what I'll feature in that part of the talk. So pipes is associated with the Pipestone National Monument in Pipestone, Minnesota. And then finally, mounds, for the bundles, pipes, and mounds piece, is Cahokia Mounds in Collinsville, Illinois. And with the brochure, you can see some of what I'll do is feature material that's in the brochure, but there's a lot of information there, so I'll go through some slides more quickly than others so that I can have an opportunity to talk to you about some of the insights that I had and some of the experiences I think that might help inform or shape possibly your experiences if you opt to venture any of these to any of these sites. So just out of curiosity, has anyone been to any of these places, the other Pipestone? How many, just by show of hands, how many of you have been to Pipestone National Monument? Awesome. How many of you have been to Cahokia Mounds? Awesome. How many of you been to the Pawnee Museum in Republic, Kansas? Nobody. Wow. And that's one of the sites that's closest distance to you, so hopefully I'll inspire you to go. So this is kind of a variation of what's in your handout or your brochure that gives you probably everything you wanted to know about, if you, as a tourist, as a person visiting these sites, the status of the site. Pawnee Indian Museum happens to be a state historic site for Kansas. The locations there, hours of operations, whether there's a fee, and things to see and do, which I think is kind of important to kind of get a heads up before you go there. Not that you can have impromptu organic experiences too, but it's a very interesting site, and it's very worthy of its designation as a state historic site, and one of the many things about our state we should be very proud of. So one of the things that may not be apparent to any of you, since none of you have been to this site, is its significance. And maybe you do or do not know much about the Pawnee Indians. So I have some information here, lots of text on this slide, but I'll highlight a few things about the Pawnee and why this location is sort of a celebration of this particular tribe in our state. So we know that historically the Pawnee lived in central Nebraska and northern Kansas, and numbered about 10,000 or more members in 4 subgroups. They were semi-sedentary. In the spring, they lived in these dome-shaped lodges, which you can see a picture of here, and you'll see another in a moment. And they planted corn, beans, and squash. During the summer, they moved into the high plains and lived in bowl-shaped shelters while hunting bison. In the late summer, they returned to their lodges to harvest, process, and store their crops. And in the winter, they returned back to the high plains and lived off of buffalo hide teepees that were more mobile while hunting bison. And then another thing we need to realize is that the social structure of the Pawnee, the basic unit of the Pawnee social structure was the village. And a band could include members of 1 to 6 villages, which is something that you'll further appreciate if you actually visit the site. Each band was governed by a head chief, and an important symbol of the chief's office was the communal sacred bundle, hence bundles, pipes, and mounds. So bundle is very important to this particular tribe, which represented the community's history, and it gave identity and validity to these tribes. The individual family lodges were arranged so as to represent the universe. The west side of each lodge included a raised altar adorned with a buffalo skull, over which was suspended the family's sacred bundle. And you'll hear me talk about two different kinds of bundles: the sacred bundle, the family sacred bundle, and then there was the sort of the community tribal sacred bundle. So whereas communal bundles, I couldn't have segued better, I think. The community bundle was derived powers from the sacred beings of the heavens. Family bundles derived their powers from sacred beings of the earth. And some of you were here this morning that heard my talk about the physical, metaphysical nexus that traditional ecological knowledge might bring us. I mean, maybe this might help further elaborate on a discussion that I started this morning. So Tirawa, the supreme being or great spirit, was the creator of the world. His wife, the corn mother, who led the people from their original place within the earth to the surface. Below Tirawa and Tira were the sacred beings of the heavens and of the earth. And you can see there's some detail about sort of the metaphysical or spiritual aspects of this relationship, this idea of sacred beings and why this was important to this culture. So religion and concern for the supernatural permeated Pawnee life. And the bundle scheme was the foundation on which their social and ceremonial organization rested. So bundles are very important to this tribe. By the end of the 20th century, the Pawnee had been reduced to less than 700 members, largely through violence and disease. The communal village life had been replaced by individual farm life. Traditional subsistence patterns had been replaced by agriculture and government rations. The authority of chiefs had been replaced by that of agents, and religious ceremonies and the knowledge of sacred bundles were rapidly disappearing. As to those who possess that knowledge, often died without the knowledge being passed on and the care for these bundles and traditions being replaced. So again, an image of the bundle. A little bit more about the bundle. So physically, you probably can get a sense from that image, a sacred bundle is a collection of symbolic and ritual objects wrapped in buffalo hide. Because each bundle has its origin in a different supernatural encounter, the contents of a particular bundle would vary, but all contain the same types of objects. This becomes very important to a question I'll ask of you and a question I've been asking myself since I visited the site. So one or more ears of the best specimen, if you think about this, I'll come back to this, this idea of corn and how they sort of kind of a sustainability move when you think about it. And particularly with an agricultural reliance, a community that relied on agriculture at some point in their experience. Part of their annual year was sedentary. So one or more ears of the best specimen of corn were harvested, were added to the bundle, and that gave it life. These ears were removed in the spring and used for seed and replaced after the fall harvest. So you see how it might be a good practice. I mean, you essentially pick your best specimen, store it away. When the ritual bundle contents were opened in the ceremonial way, the corn was planted, and then you had this practice perpetuate in this tribe. There are other common objects included. In fact, you could see, I'll go back to this, you can see on the outside there, I mentioned this the first presentation, it's very visible that there's a pipe, there's a Calumet pipe on the external of this bundle. So this was a tribe that very much participated in Calumet ceremonies, and you see that represented here. So these objects included things like arrows, arrow fragments, pipes or pipe bowls, and often attached to the outer bundle that were as offerings to the bundle in its ritual openings. So metaphysically, again, I used that term this morning, essentially as a distinction between what we do in science and we think about the physical and the natural world. There's this other sort of way of knowing, as I described it this morning. So metaphysically, the sacred bundle is a source of power to which the village can turn for assistance. So except during ceremonial rituals, the bundle hangs from the rafters, and you can actually see this represented when you visit the site. It hangs from the rafters on the west side of the caretaker's lodge over the sacred altar. And so this is kind of lifted from one of the publications I have up here at the front. When so hung, it was likened by the Pawnees to a dead man in his grave. The spirit lived in it but slept. Even when opened, the bundle continued asleep until the mother corn had been placed in it. It then came to life, and during the ceremony, the corn and other objects represented individually and collectively supernatural beings. So again, that the publication is up front if you want to see more or hear more about it. So here's where it kind of gets interesting in terms of how this bundle wound up in the museum. And again, I have this question that I'll pose to you and we can think about together. Well, in 1987, a Pawnee woman donated a family sacred bundle to the Kansas State Historical Society. The bundle remained unopened for over a century. Because in 1873, the U.S. government granted the Pawnee permission to travel into western Nebraska to hunt bison. During that time, approximately 250 men, 100 women, and 50 children made their journey from the reservation into central Nebraska. The Sioux had also been granted permission to hunt bison in the same area. So on the return journey, the Pawnee, who were armed with bows and arrows, encountered Sioux and were attacked by approximately 1,000 Sioux who were armed with firearms. So as it turns out, approximately 150 Pawnee were killed, 11 women and children were captured. And during the battle, a Pawnee man tied his young daughter to a pack horse, tied the family sacred bundle to the girl's back, told her to take care of the bundle, and sent the horse running so that the girl survived, even though her parents did not. So this bundle, you can trace back to that historic event. So as we know, any special ceremonies belonging to the bundle were forever lost in this carnage at Massacre Canyon. So according to the donor, the bundle had not been ritually opened and is therefore intact as it was left in the canyon in 1873. And as it turns out, there's a practice or a caretaker role that female members of the tribe play. So the bundle was cared for by female members only in the family until none were remained who were willing to accept the responsibility, at which time it was donated to society. So, over that century, this bundle had been passed down through the family and to the women who were receiving of the bundle until this woman decided, I'm going to donate this to the museum. So the bundle, is generally cylindrical, approximately, did I go back? Yes, didn't sound right. I thought I already said that. So this bundle came to the museum. The donor gave permission to open the bundle and examine the contents and undertake necessary conservation action. And so that kind of raises maybe the first red flag in terms of, again, maybe some of what may or may not have been sort of a violation of this historic, cultural practice, metaphysical significance at least. So without treatment, the leather straps were too brittle, to survive the process of untying it. So the semi-tan leather would not also survive traditional conservation methods. And so the scientists or the museum caretakers decided to forego, opening the bundle for purposes of conservation. So instead, they attempted to regulate the decay by controlling the conditions of exhibition. So it's hung in a specific place. The picture that you saw is it's the only picture that I didn't take that's in the slide set and in your brochure, because flashing and the camera itself could interfere with the preservation process. So this is very much, there's attempts to restrict access to the bundle. But here's where it gets interesting. So it was decided again that they wanted to open it because they had permission to open it, decided to use currently available non-invasive, quote, techniques to study the bundle's contents. So specifically, the bundle was initially subjected to X-ray radiation to produce 4 sets of radiographic images of its contents, and then a set in each direction along its short axis and along the longitudinal axis, so that you have this sort of X-ray kind of blueprint of what's inside. And then it was followed up by a CAT scan process, which produces images in slices. And you think about, if you've seen medical programs, this is kind of get an image of more specific about in locations within the bundle. So we have this non-invasive procedure that kept the bundle intact, but it also revealed the contents within. So analysis of these images indicated the presence of an inner liner, which may have been some type of grass material, grass mat. Other contents included rocks, sticks, possibly sweetgrass, possibly either a simulated or a real human scalp, animal or bird bones, bird skins, arrow fragments, bells, and a pouch of possibly paint. So the image, though, and this is interesting for what I said earlier about corn, the image failed to reveal an ear of corn. And so, as mentioned, the ear would have been removed in the spring and planted and then replaced in the fall after a harvest. But the massacre occurred the massacre in which the bundle opening ritual was lost occurred in August after the spring planting and before the fall harvest, which explains why you didn't have a sample of the best corn included in the bundle, which may explain why it didn't contain corn. So it's unclear whether this means that the bundle is dead or simply dormant, and whether, and this is my question, I'm leading you up to this, whether we have an issue here, an ethical issue, is this research, or, on one hand, it's, for the sake of science, for the sake of, understanding the culture, let's use a non-invasive way. Another side of the story may be that it could be regarded as a desecration. So ethical considerations are raised about the treatment of the bundle, and we know that historically researchers have opened bundles to satisfy scientific curiosity, including 5 bundles that were opened by research in the Field Museum in Chicago. And all these bundles were opened upon their arrival. Information as to the exact contents of each bundle was not recorded, and at present all of the contents are stored together. So, again, if you feel during Q&A, you may, or even now, if you want to comment, is that a worry for us as scientists or as museum curators in terms of regarding the metaphysical significance and honoring the culture? So the behavior is sometimes referred to as colonial science. It's science carried out under different standards for indigenous peoples than for colonial peoples because of different political, economic, and social standings. And so as the argument goes, or the question is posed, had this been a Christian rather than indigenous sacred artifacts, would they have received much greater respect or different kinds of respect? And so I'll just leave that out for consideration at the end. So now I'll transition to the pipes part of the talk, the Pipestone talk. And again, those of you who attended the first presentation heard and saw some of the slides that I included, although I have some new ones. I'm going to read this because I think it's powerful just to kind of make this point about the metaphysics of Native views and how the pipe had a significance. I talked about the sacred pipe, and so why is it sacred? Well, here's one story that explains how that came to be. So the Dakota Sioux tell the story of 2 men hunting. Far away they saw something white and shining coming towards them. The first thought it was a white buffalo calf. As it approached, they saw it change into a young, beautiful girl, dressed in white buckskin. She was carrying a highly decorated pipe. One of the men was filled with desire for the maiden. Because his thoughts offended the powers above, his flesh withered away, and his flesh fell off in a heap on the prairie. The other man, his mind filled with awe and respect for the maiden, was given the pipe with instructions for its care and use. The maiden then turned and walked away, finally changing into a white buffalo calf and disappearing over the horizon. The young man returned to his camp and his people, and then lived out his days greatly respected as the keeper of the sacred pipe. And it's believed that a pipe closely guarded and cared for is said to be the original pipe, is preserved by one tribe of the Dakota Sioux. I had a different image the first time I shared this story. I'm going to share this image, which is, I'd say hot off the press, but I'd say it's hot off the canvas. This was painted by a good friend, Brent Leonard, who is an Arapaho artist, and it is his rendition of a pipe, the Buffalo Calf Woman story. And you can see a person here with a pipe, and in the distance, this maiden appearing. So He does really cool abstract art, and I have quite a few of his pieces in my own collection. So the origin stories, reveal a lot about how things come to be and how the meaning comes to be. In this case, I'm talking about Plains Indian tribes, but we also have other sources of information, as I emphasized in the first talk. There's various ethnographic accounts of European contact with tribes that reference certain Calumet ceremonies. And so what I did in that first talk is talk about how the pipe is more than what maybe you think it is from popular literature or popular communications. It's more than smoked after an agreement. It's more than a signing of a treaty and a kind of sealing a deal. It has a spiritual, it has a political, it has a social significance. And we know that in part through ethnographic accounts. And we also know a lot about the origin of the materials used for the pipe, which is part of my story too, is the geology is really rich at this Pipestone National Monument that we can trace when we find, in the archaeological record, materials that were parts or pieces of pipes that were likely, if not known to be quarried at particular locations. So it says something about maybe the political significance and how these pipes might have been used to build alliances within a tribe and between visiting European settlers. It kind of kept the peace in a way on a broader scale. So as I said, it all began with an intriguing day trip. And as I said to some of you out when we were having our reception, technically every one of these sites can be visited within a day's drive of Johnson County Community College. This one is the longest route. It's about 6 hours from here. So if you get up early in the morning and you leave and you go to this site, you can hang out there for a while, go through the area that's part of the tourist experience. You can go to see the reception area, you can go to the museum, and then get back home by midnight. We did that. I would recommend that you take a more leisurely look, and as you read through this, maybe you'll be inspired to do so. But I always tell my students when I'm talking about a place maybe they've never been, look at the map and figure out where you are. Well, you are here in Kansas. You want to go here. Here's some routes that you can take to get there, but where you're going to wind up is this kind of southwest corner of Minnesota in this case. When you get there, you'll be overwhelmed. In fact, I'll give you an excerpt from a journal of George Catlin, who describes it for you. And some of you, many of you, sound like you've been here, so you maybe are agreeable that it's a very beautiful place. The geology is beautiful. The vegetation's beautiful. I mean, it's just a place where you really it's a great destination site just to experience the natural beauty. So here's a couple of other images. So you can see, you kind of appreciate some vegetation. I'm pointing to some lichen that's growing on this is Sioux Quartzite. This isn't the Pipestone itself. And then you'll also see along sort of the guided part of there's a little trail that you can follow. There's places where you can break out and look, and this happens to be the Oracle. So there's a little sign that you look through, and then when you kind of look through the peephole, you see this this etching. Really, it's kind of looks like a face of a native person that's been eroded, really into the geology. So it's kind of a cool feature. Another thing, if you look down and around, you'll see evidence of others who've been there before you. And I thought this was really, really powerful because I'm not sure you can read the dates, but there's dates of people who've been here in 1790 and 1908. And so it's like graffiti of the day, only nicely etched into the rock that tells you that, there's others that had been here before you quite a while ago, and you're walking, a similar path. So there's waterfalls, there's prairie, there's like lots of things that would appeal if you are a nature lover or an ecologist like I am. So Pipestone. For centuries, Pipestone has been an item of ceremonial importance, as well as an object of trade, as I mentioned before. The process of extracting the Pipestone, though, is where it gets kind of interesting. So it's very, very difficult, as the next image will reveal. The quarry process is slow, but it represents an important part of the Pipestone tradition. And so we know, again, from a gentleman I'll introduce to you in a moment here, George Catlin, that certain tribes are known to believe, or they're believed to be the first to quarry this site, but it was a site that numerous tribes in this region accessed for the pipestone itself. So here's a cross-sectional view, and this happens to be a National Park Service sketch. And it's, I guess the place to orient yourself is, you know, you're up here, you might have started up here, you're over here, but this is what you're trying to access. So these guys are like, you know, chipping away, and you'll see that sometimes because of the delicacy of the material, you're using wheelbarrows and sort of hand tools because you don't want to destroy the very thing that you're trying to access. And a lot of times you can secure pieces in fairly large chunks so that you can carve something as, you know, ornamental and decorative as you see in front of you. So it's a tedious process that I think this sketch helps reveal. So depending on the specific quarry, experience has shown that quarrying time can be estimated at 2 to 6 weeks. So there's really motivation and really dedication to accessing this material. And so again, by using shovels, wheelbarrows, you know, the soil layers removed, set aside, and then these rubble piles are there. And I have a couple of images coming up that shows you what that kind of looks like. We also know that there are other quarry sites. There's one in Wisconsin, there's one in Utah, there's Canadian quarries. As it turns out, the Pipestone National Monument in Minnesota is still actively quarried by Native Americans. And it's, you know, I had a good question the first time I presented on this topic. It's like, well, how does that work? Because wouldn't it be, you know, it's too much access may destroy the material, and you might run out, if you will. It's, you know, Native Americans, there's a permit system, and I believe it's something between like 48 and 53 permits per year, but it is pretty well regulated and monitored, and not anyone can access. You couldn't go out and start accessing this unless you were Native American and navigated the process of that allowed for access. So here's some pipestone, just kind of raw pipestone, and this happens to be from Wisconsin. This is, again, I mentioned that you can see that we're trying to access this stuff down here, but look how thick the layer of quartzite is above it. So it took some time to get to this site, but this is pipestone from Pipestone, Minnesota, as we say in science, in situ. It's not a chunk of material on the table. This is what it would look like if you, from a kind of bird's eye view, above a site that's being quarried. So pipes, there are many different kinds and styles of pipes, and again, I have a couple up here that you can peruse after the talk. The ceremony we know is important. It was practiced by American tribes across the Great Plains in the 17th and 18th century. But as I mentioned, we know it's rooted in historic past because archaeological evidence supports that. We have ethnographic accounts that takes us back, to times before some of the actual engravings, as you'll see here in a moment, on some museum specimen. But ceremonies consisted of singing, dancing, chanting, smoking, and again, it was through these ceremonies that it's believed that peace and alliances were formed. The kinds of pipes varied, as did the ceremonies performed. Again, the archaeological evidence helps us make this case that the ceremony extended a kinship connection to the visiting group. So you could have a ceremony within a tribe for various reasons, but then as we had contact with European visitors, it became this way of extending kinship and connection to these visiting groups and sort of stabilizing maybe a potentially chaotic or uncertain relationship. So again, it developed bonds of reciprocity, mutual obligation, and it was believed that the pipes were used to promote stability, were widely distributed, as I mentioned, was found in the archaeological evidence. I just included a couple of pieces. I didn't include this on the first talk, but this happened to be collected by George Catlin. You're going to say, boy, I hear that name a lot. Who is this guy? Well, you'll see here in a moment. He collected this in the 1830s, and this is a museum object. The number is there. The University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology holds this in its collection. This is another image, and this was actually inspired by one of the questions that I got in the first talk about the stems. You see up here, there's one that's wood, but there are, examples of the pipes itself with longer extensions that are stem-like or complete stems, which are really, really kind of cool. And so this is more of a extended bowl. So this is a piece that was engraved, and we know it looks like we have an 1860 inscription by a member of the Yankton Sioux tribe. So we have the origin of this, and I believe this is in the British Museum. So there's artifacts, all across the world, really. So this George Catlin guy, who is he? Well, by the way, I'm featuring him at the Pipestone location, but when you go to the Pawnee Museum, when you walk in the doors, there's usually there's a guide that greets you, and along the walls you'll see some of Catlin's art. One piece I actually include here in a moment in my slide set. So he's everywhere. And you'll see he traveled far and wide because he was very, very interested in Native American culture. I thought this was kind of an interesting take on his bio because he's born in Pennsylvania. As a child, he was interested in natural history, science, and the arts. He was homeschooled and later trained as a lawyer. He gave up his law career when a group of Native Americans visited Philadelphia, which sparked his interest so much that he dedicated his life to painting Indians in their native land. And oh, by the way, it seems to be that he was a self-taught artist. So he abandoned his law career and kind of ventured out to sort of celebrate and preserve these landscapes and these images of Native peoples. So from 1830 to 1836, and you notice that first museum piece was collected by Catlin in the 1830s, he traveled thousands of miles from Missouri to Southwest. He produced 470 portraits and portrayals of Indian life, including one that I feature here of his rendition of Pipestone National Monument. So this basically talks about sort of a riverboat trip that he went and accessed different tribes, and that's part of a collection, which, by the way, if you Google his name, the Smithsonian has an online gallery where you can see many of his images. So it was during his travels that he noticed that some of the chiefs and warriors had pipes made of how he described it as a richly colored red stone. So when he asked about the stone, he was told about this single quarry, at a dividing ridge between Missouri and Mississippi rivers, and the Indians claimed it was a sacred site, and many tribes met in peace at the quarry to secure the stone, which was, quote, the color of human blood. So Catlin was so fascinated with this, he wanted to go to the site, and so despite some objections by certain members, certain indigenous groups, he insisted on going. He accessed the site, and he took a small sample of the pipestone and sent it off to be analyzed, and as it turns out, this material had not been previously described and recorded, and so the geologists that recorded it, analyzed it, and cataloged it, gave it the name catlinite. So the specific kind of, as I mentioned here, metamorphic mudstone that we know geologically represents pipestone generally, this particular type is called catlinite in honor of the man who took a sample and sent it off and had it analyzed, and now it's honoring his discovery. This sometimes comes up, what did they smoke in the pipe? So I included this, and we spent a little bit more time talking about this at the first session, but it depended on the tribe, because some tribes actually grew tobacco, but there's this term that represents a blend of leaves, stems, and bark from a variety of different kinds of materials that were available in the area with particular significance to the tribes, and Kanik is this term, and as it turns out, you can, when you go into the museum, you can see sort of areas that kind of depict different aspects of the ceremony, and there's one that actually speaks to this very, very issue. So I included this, just kind of this is the tribes, or this is the area we're talking about. I mentioned Plains tribe, although when we get to the Cahokia, it's more appropriate really to refer to that group as Mississippian, but we're talking about groups that, you see a lot of the names represented here, probably too small for you to read, but I mentioned a couple that are represented here that were depicted in some of Catlin's research. So we're talking about this swath of the U.S., including Kansas, that is well represented in these sites. So Catlin was an early explorer. He wasn't the first, as it turns out. In fact, this guy, Nicolay, was, I didn't include it in my images, but there's a location on Pipestone's site that's featured because this guy was a French scientist and geographer who came to the site over 3 expeditions to map the upper Mississippi area. So it's actually sort of a place that you're guided to see, and it shows his etching on rocks in that area. So what I thought was interesting about this list is they were there for different reasons. You had Le Sueur, who was a French trader. You had Philander Prescott, who's there to get beaver, but he's accessing this site. Makes sense. It's in this nexus between the Mississippi and Missouri River, so good place maybe to find beaver. And so while he's there, there's evidence of his presence, and so in dates that predate, if you will, Catlin. So this is Catlin, and again, he painted a lot. He traveled throughout a large area and painted many portraits of chiefs and Native Americans kind of in their environment, if you will. But one of his most famous that is representative of this Pipestone area is this that maybe you've seen before, because it is pretty, I've actually seen it in documentaries and on Native American. I didn't know what it was until I'd visited the site. It's also prominently featured at Pipestone National Monument. But I look at this, and you can see some things that maybe will make a little more sense here in a moment. But you have this rock wall, this Winnenessus Falls. There's this Three Maidens, which is these geological formations, a different kind of rock. It's igneous rock that's believed to have washed in or kind of glided in, if you will, on ice sheets. So this is kind of sedimentary, this is igneous, different kind of rock. So it's distinct enough that the natives reviewed it, regarded it, revered it, and so it's honored and celebrated. So look at this and kind of capture that in your mind. And then this is what I was referring to. This is from Catlin's journal. So there's a lot there, and I bolded some terms, parts of it that I think make the whole point. So he's embarking on this expedition. He encounters something that looks like this, and he represented it in his painting like this, but he describes it as follows. The principal and most striking feature of this place is a perpendicular wall of close-grained compact quartz of 25 and 30 feet in elevation, running nearly north and nearly north and south, with its face to the west, exhibiting a front of nearly 2 miles in length, which disappears on both ends into a prairie. So pretty fair, maybe description of what you just saw. At the base of the wall, there is a level prairie a half-mile in, parallel to it, in any and all parts of which the Indians procure the red stone for their pipes by digging through the soil and several slaty layers of the red stone to a depth of 4 to 5 feet. From the very numerous marks of ancient and modern diggings and excavations, it would appear that this place has been, for many centuries, resorted to for this red stone, and it would seem, as well as from their actual traditions, that the Indian tribes have long held this place in high superstitious estimation, which is important for part of what I'll say at the end. So that's Catlin's, kind of first-hand account in 1836 of what he saw, and then represented in this famous painting. So here's some other images I mentioned. You'll see if you go into the Pawnee Museum, you'll see this first one because it's a Pawnee chief, and then you have an Osage and a Blackfoot Plains Indian tribes represented there. So we're now ready for the mounds part of the bundles, pardon mounds. And again, some of you, it seems like there were several hands that indicated that you had visited Cahokia. So this is a variation of what you have in your handout, in your little brochure, that describes, again, the status, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a National Historic Landmark. It's a state historic site for Illinois. And you'll maybe get a better appreciation for that here in a moment. It's a fascinating place. So lots to see and to appreciate that's well represented when you go to the site itself. But again, this is hopefully giving you a heads up of things to look for, maybe inspiration to go. So this is sort of an image of one of the kiosks that describes Cahokia as the city of the sun, one of the great cities of the world. It was larger than London was in 1250 AD. There was not a larger city in the U.S. until 1800 when the population of Philadelphia grew to over 30,000. So just imagine that. In fact, back here, I was going to point this out. You know, it's believed at its highest population, some accounts indicate like 40,000, sometimes you see 20,000. And so this morning, when I was thinking about this, what can we relate that to? So I made a list of thinking, well, what's in Kansas that's about? So Hays is about, according to the most recent census, 21,038. Garden City, my hometown, 26,966. Leavenworth, 35,251. These are, you know, you think about if you've been to any of these places, it might give you Hutchison was the other one there. I couldn't read my writing. Hutchison's 42,080. So those are ones that were approximately, you know, between this range of an upper limit of 20 or 40,000. If you can kind of feature in your mind, if you've been to any of those places, that was the size of, relatively speaking, of Cahokia at this time. And what is also pretty interesting is that it was condensed, you know, within a pretty small area. So you had a lot of activity and a lot of, as you might guess, necessary social structure in order to have that many people living together in that tight of proximity in this location. So another mural that's at the site. So preserves it. So what does Cahokia achieve in terms of something why we would go there and appreciate it? Well, it preserves the remains of the central section of this largest prehistoric Indian city north of Mexico. It's been recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's believed to be first inhabited around 700 AD by prehistoric Indians of the late woodland culture, and in 800 another culture emerged, and this was I was referring to earlier, you'll sometimes see regarded as the Mississippian culture around 1800 AD. So these people developed an agriculture system with corn, squash, sunflower, you know, food crops, if you will, maygrass, barley, and then that was supplemented by also hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plants. So in this way, they were able to develop a large, complex community with a highly social, political, and religious organization. So what about that social structure? So you look at this as another image from the site itself, and you see you have this great sun chief here at the top. Ooh, I should be using my pointer. Can you guys see when yeah, you can see. So there's great sun chief here at the top, city of the sun. And so this was sort of, in the social structure, this was the highest, most elite, I guess, in the group. He and his family lived this life of privilege, and sort of everyone down the ranks sort of worked for his need in comforts and his families. And then below that, you have this elite class of priests and chieftains, which counseled the great sun, the leader in matters of religion and government. And then you see there's another tier here, the leaders. And then down here you have the commoners, which their primary job was to build these mounds that I'll talk about here in a second. So when I saw this, I was thinking, that reminds me of something. It reminds me of our org chart. So, you know, maybe Joe Sobchak is the great sun chief, and maybe, you know, the leaders are members of the cabinet, and maybe the IDC over here, our dean's council, are the leaders, and then down here the commoners, that would be the faculty. So I actually thought about constructing a hierarchy and just superimposing their little faces, but I was like, well, maybe better. So it turns out the commoners were very important to the construction of these mounds, and this is what it entails. And I mentioned, you know, hand tools. Here's an example from the exhibit that shows you so just to have in mind, you know, what this looked like. So I mentioned, you know, it's kind of a very highly developed, kind of densely packed area with people, but 6 square miles, and had a population estimate, you know, and one estimate is 10 to 20,000, but at its peak, you know, we see 40,000. So houses were arranged around this open courtyard. Agriculture was fields were right outside the city. It's believed that there was originally 120 mounds, but only 109 have been recorded, and of these, 70 are preserved right on site. The mounds are entirely made of earth. Soil is dug using the tools like the one I just showed you, and carried on the backs in baskets of by the commoners. So again, go back to my teacher, dean, cabinet analogy. Maybe it may or may not apply, but they were doing a lot of their life experiences was dedicated to building these mounds. So what's the purpose of the mound, you might be asking? Well, it's primarily used for ceremonial activities of the living, although there were certain times that were associated with burial, and I'll show you an image coming up of one that's pretty famous associated with this site. So the most common type at Kokia is the platform mound, which is square or rectangular with sloping sides, but these conical or ridgetop mounds are also prevalent in the 109 that have been identified, and are believed to be used for burials or to mark significant locations, although most of the people, when they died, were buried in cemeteries. So this is a sort of a replica of what archaeologists found at mound number 72, which is a really well-documented excavated site that was excavated in 67 through 71. And so I'm not sure it's clear. Well, you can kind of see there's arrows, and there's these little structures are shells. So somebody counted they found the remains with obviously someone pretty prominent in status on this bed of these shell pieces, 20,000 shell beads, and several people were buried near him, and included many grave offerings, including 800 perfectly crafted arrow points. So that kind of gives credence to the idea that this guy was probably pretty important in the society. And so they have this as a kind of a replica of that on site. And there's some other kind of images from the museum itself that kind of gives you an idea of what they try to reconstruct the culture. Well, Monk's Mound is a site, and it's believed that the Sun Chief lived at the top of Monk's Mound. And what's very apparent if you've ever visited this site are the stairs. And they weren't, made of this kind of steel material with guardrails at the time. It was mostly wood, but it was terraced in 2 layers. And this is a view. This is kind of looking at so this is looking down from, if you start from the roadway here and walk up, you have to walk all of those stairs, and then you get to this kind of platform area, and then you turn around and you walk up these stairs, and then you get to this kind of open area that you can, look around and kind of see, various, have a really good view of the horizon. And you can also look, and if I remember, you look to your right and you see St. Louis. So again, one of these things you can do if you decide to go to the site is know that in very, very close proximity, you can go visit the site and take in all that is there to see, and then you can go hang out in St. Louis if you wish. So Woodhenge is another featured part of this experience, and that's too small to read, but hopefully you get the impression that this was reconstructed or something about this circular, appearance. Well, it's believed to be a prehistoric solar calendar. So again, it kind of gives you an idea of how maybe advanced, if you will, these peoples were. And so these inserts are just kind of blown up. They're not that, oops, you don't see it, I see it, presenter view. There's at least 5 large post-circular monuments were built, and there's some information down here about basically where they're positioned. It catches the sun in a certain way, and it was marked. So most important alignments are the winter and summer solstices, marking the southernmost and northernmost sunrise. And so City of the Sun, think about the science or the local knowledge or whatever we want to call it that went into making those observations and noting, where the sun fell and when they fell, and how this kind of turned out over time to be a way of, like they described it, a prehistoric sun calendar. So it's really kind of a cool notion. Well, it led me to ask the question, well, so what happened? I'm talking about this city that was very, very advanced and socially, politically, structured. So what happened? Because, it's not thriving today, and we know that there was a period of essentially collapse. So Well, there's some different ideas. The cause of the end of Cahokia is really not completely known, but one theory is they depleted their resources in this area and had shortages of needed materials. Another is climate change, because so much of their existence was dependent upon sort of an agriculture, food presence, and so changing climate may have interfered with their food supply. Conflict and warfare was believed to have increased during this time, and so maybe you had warring groups that led to enough upheaval that you had sort of splitting off, and that became it's an interesting question from a cultural anthropologist view. We know that there's a gradual decline in the population during a particular time frame, but it's not clear where these people might have gone or what tribes they might have become. So what happened, and we have this sort of success story with all of these elements of identification of things that could go wrong. I'll give you a shameless plug, because I know I see some students in the room. I'm going to be teaching an honors forum in fall of 2017 that's called Causes and Consequences of Ecosystems Collapse, because this is not a unique story, particularly if it was overexploitation of resources. Essentially, we see that all the time in situations where non-human species outstrip their resources, and that leads to some kind of collapse. So whether it's an ecosystems collapse or whether it's a political induced collapse, these things kind of converge into an interesting story to contemplate, and there's many examples that I'll explore in this honors forum, and I've invited other faculty members. It'll be very much an interdisciplinary experience to look at it from a political science and from an anthropology and from an ecological point of view, and so it won't be me as the only person talking, and then students will have an opportunity to explore examples of their choice. So stay tuned. So this is a lot of detail here, and so I always feel like kind of to bring it all home, here's some of my final thoughts, but certainly you'll have your own, and hopefully some of what I've said will prompt you to look for things and maybe to go in armed with the information I've shared tonight. But when you look at, and I am going to use my pointer here if I can find it, because I'll turn away from this, and can you guys hear me from this one? This one on? So, oops, he told me not to do that. So, Pipestone Pawnee Indian Museum in Cahokia. So that's where we've been. So one thought I had is, we're really fortunate that we live in a state with such rich ecological, cultural history, as represented by the Pawnee Indian Museum, but also the fact that we are living in close proximity to these sites you can get to in just a day. And I've themed my discussion around indigenous cultural resources, but I could very much have done a presentation on ecological resources, and again, you can see a lot and do a lot if you are so inclined to explore. So Pipestone National Monument, we know it's a national park, but it's also a sacred site. The significance of the site, it can extend beyond the function of the objects that you might find there, and this is where I kind of blend this idea of metaphysical and symbolic importance, which is really heavy on my mind these days, because my most recent degree was ethics, and I think about sometimes, particularly the intersection of science and ethics. There's a lot that we do, and there's a lot of good intentions about, like we saw with the Sacred Bundle. But there also begs the question, are there some ethical dimensions to this? Ought we do? Some of what we do for the sake of understanding that may, in some respects, be, as you'll see here with the bundle, arguably a desecration if it's disrespectful to the culture. Do we really need to know what's in the bundle? And I asked before the talk if I could quote a member of the audience, that I had this conversation afterwards, and the quote is that the sacredness is in the mystery of not knowing the contents. So what makes it sacred? And is an X-ray really non-invasive? Is a CAT scan really non-invasive? Do we really need to know what's inside? And in doing so, did we trade off something that is forever lost in doing that procedure? And Cahokia, again, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It has rich geology, rich ecological, anthropological, archaeological. I mean, the list goes on. There's something there probably for everyone in the room. But it's also the final resting place of members of this particular tribe, this particular culture. So Cahokia offers an intriguing look into the past of a complex, highly complex city, and a look back at its collapse. So I say, and this is kind of my final thoughts on this, I inserted again something that's actually at the Cahokia site. The site and its mounds are sacred to American Indians. Please treat them with respect. So explore, go visit these sites armed with my brochure, armed with some of the ideas and the thoughts maybe that I've inspired today, but explore respectfully and realize that sometimes you're walking on ground that's sacred to some, or you're, the idea, what comes to mind with Cahokia is that Monk's Mound site with the stairwells is frequently, there's joggers on the stairwell. And I guess it makes sense because it's a good workout. Is that respectful to the site? Is bringing dogs onto the site of Pipestone, while maybe technically allowed, is that respectful of the site? And is this search for knowledge that we are invested in as scientists, is it worth it if you irreversibly invade, potentially desecrate something that has, for centuries, as we saw in this particular case, was unopened, and you really can't go back. So points to think about, and at this point, I guess I'll take questions. I have a list of references, but I'll go back if you have questions, and I mean this sincerely. On the back, I have brochures, and I actually have my business cards. I like these dialogues to continue, and I know sometimes people don't like to speak up in class or in public lectures, but if you have thoughts or you want some of my resources, citations and so on, contact me. There's multiple ways of doing that. Come to my office, call me, email me, take my class. This can be a continuing experience for both of us. That lasts way beyond, one college scholar talk on a Wednesday evening. So with that, I'll take questions if you have any. Sure.
I'm just wondering, this was very interesting talk, and besides the question that you raised about respect and, sacredness and all that, what I'm wondering is that what is there in all this scientific research and stuff, what is there in it for them? The Native Americans, whose life is so devastated, are we using them, or is there something very significant for them?
And let me make sure I understand the question. What's in it for the researcher?
No.
Okay.
The Native Indigenous American people.
I see.
Life is so devastated. How do they gain from it?
Well, it's a really interesting question, and I know I have at least one member of the audience that is Native American. I would open up, to any kind of dialogue if anyone feels so inclined to share. But what comes to mind immediately is just understanding, is appreciation, maybe of having, a place like we have with the Pawnee Museum, where you have sort of a replication of the location where they lived, and you have information, historic information, and sort of a showcasing, if you will, of a culture that might otherwise not be so made so clear or abundantly clear to local peoples. So there's that. And I guess it's, in some cases with regard to the quarry, I mean, there's a lot of presence. There's a lot of, people go to the site because it's a national monument, it's beautiful, but there's revenue generated that preserves the museum. It's a place where Native American artists can sell. Everything that's up here was handcrafted by Native artists. There's that. So, I mean, it's hard for me as a non-Native person to answer, other than to say probably the biggest contribution I would think it makes is it just educates a public about peoples that may not otherwise be on the radar, or sites that may not be on the radar, unless, you know something about or live near the area, or, or have a brochure that guides you and tells you things that you could look and know and learn at a place. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. That's not mine. That's Ed Smith's publication. Yeah. Yeah, that was something that that was not part of my presentation, but we wanted to make available. I don't know what that's about. Yeah, I know nothing about what went behind the creation of that, other than there's a space provided to make it available. Any other thoughts or comments? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Mm-hmm. It may be on a list now to go see. Yeah, but I don't personally. I've not been there, and I don't know. Yeah, I've actually heard of it in some of the research I've done. I know that there are certainly indigenous and cultural aspects to explore, but it's not a place that I can speak firsthand of as visiting. Mm-hmm. Okay. No, I don't know. I have not. Oh, very cool. Yes.
One of your slides about the demise of the people mentioned that of the various causes of disease, so on, wars and times, climate change and stuff like that. I began to think about Cahokias, especially, because they were living in the Mississippi Valley, and the New Madrid seismic zone. It has a recurrence interval of major earthquakes every 225 to 250 years. And the last major one, as we all know, is well recorded, it occurred in 1812. So many psychologists believe that we are ready for a big one.
Oh, okay.
Almost about 200 years. But if you go back, they have done some archaeological studies, and they found that there were some major events around the same New Madrid fault system that occurred about 220 to 250 years. So it could be that their wiping out was related to one of the major
Seismic event, and that's what's. You'd think that there would be some evidence. I mean, some geological evidence or some, but not that it's a one-dimensional thing. It could be multiple sources, but that's certainly one that I haven't seen itemized on the list of materials that I've perused, but lots of different. Oh, absolutely. That was the appeal to me, and that was the plan, and kind of constructing these 3 talks in the way that I did, and to really take, embedded throughout, all 3, some of you have attended all 3, was ethics and science and anthropology. So you get, absolutely, and I can look at these sites, through maybe multidisciplinary lenses, but, a geologist that goes to these sites can look, with very, very crisp view at things that may escape me because it's only, one aspect of my understanding. So absolutely, very interdisciplinary. Oh, Ed, did you have a comment?
Cersei, in the 2 things. One, during that time of about 1400, there was a 45-year drought in the Midwest that they discovered, and so that is one of the main causes. Coupled with that, providing resources for a huge population and disease is kind of a lead theory as to the decline of the Cahokia. But we don't talk about it in forms of, we talk about it as declining rather than
collapsing.
ceasing to exist, because the people that were at the Cahokia have descendants today.
Absolutely.
And I'm one of those people. Our Osage folks are linked to Cahokia. We have our own oral histories, and then we also have archaeological evidence from Dr. Alice Keehill out of UC Chapel Hill. Has done some outstanding work at the site and linking it with our Osage people and our stories. But it's important to note that those folks, while there was a great amount of death that occurred, they also disbanded.
Yeah, and that's kind of feature some of the literature, and it's sort of this, we can trace with certain fidelity, I guess, to tribes, but there's kind of this global idea of, well, we know we started out with a very successful, highly populated city, and it's not completely, entirely clear, how many and what different, other than, you mentioned the Osage. I mean, you can give accounts of that trajectory of understanding, but is it a case of people just sort of split from this area because the climate got too rough for growing needed resources, or death, disease, and those kinds of things? I mean, as an ecologist, when I see that lineup of possibilities, I mean, I teach in my classes something about density-dependent, factors, that no matter what organism you are, when you live in close proximity, certain things can lead to declines in population that have to do with just the number of, density is number over unit area. So if you have, in this case, if the upper limit's right, 40,000 people living in a 6-mile radius, that's a pretty cozy environment. You have even 20,000 or so. If you think about some of the cities that I've listed, pretty contained area, so that if there was, a communicable, disease, or if there was a drought that led to decimation of food supplies, and you can see how that manifests in non-human species in ecological terms as crowding, stress, disease, famine, war. All these things kind of fall out of situations when you have a lot of any species together in a compact area that's running out of resources for whatever reason. And so I think, to your point, there's things that we know, there's things that we can speculate based on, what we can view from existing kinds of examples, but there's a lot of unknowns that's still being researched, and I think a lot more work to do with this site for anthropologists and others from discipline lenses that, as you mentioned, is very multifaceted. Yes, Jay?
Well, part of the issue here is how we tell stories, too, right? It's, we like to tell stories about things vanishing, right? What happened to the lost city of Cahokia?
Yeah.
What happened to the Anasazi,
Yeah.
right? When in reality, we had a pretty good idea what happened. We don't know exactly, or what factor did this, that, and the other thing. The Anasazi become the Pueblo. The Mississippians across the continent, or eastern half the continent, become the Osage, or they become the Choctaw, the Cherokee, or tribes that we know. But those aren't nearly as dramatic stories as the vanishing of.
Right.
It doesn't lead to Leonard Nimoy being able to do episodes of research on it.
Yeah, all right.
In 1970.
Right.
So
Yeah,
I think
fair
part of it is, as you say, we need to understand the nuanced lessons. But those nuanced lessons aren't things popular culture, so we have these narratives about so-and-so X, Y, or Z civilization vanished, and why.
Yeah.
And just a question about the Serpent Mound. That's 500, 600 years, I think, earlier than Cahokia, right? That's the Adena culture.
Yeah.
Right? So that's significantly earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to. I mean, thanks for the question, because I can be inspired by you as much as you can be inspired by me. So, loving to explore things, I think that might be on the list of a place to go. And so, stay tuned, I guess, or email me, and I'll share. Or give me your email, and I'll share if I visit the place and have things to share with you. Go ahead. This is fun. This is like exactly what I want, is a dialogue. Cahokia? Absolutely. Collinsville.
There is as far as I understand, there is a hazardous waste incinerator plant at Sauget. Is it?
Oh, yeah, the road.
You know that? Up the road very close to it?
Yeah.
So I don't know how close it is to Cahokia, the burial mounds and all that, and in locating the plant, was any study done to preserve all that
Well,
archaeological sites and stuff like that?
there's being some work done, because they're actually trying to make Cahokia, it's under the state of Illinois, but they're trying to give a national park designation But Cahokia actually stretched out, I have a really great map, unfortunately, in my office, that shows that it's just like we would think of Kansas City. There's the city that we call Cahokia, which was actually named after a later tribe that inhabited the area. But there's also suburbs, and they go up and down both sides of the river. In fact, St. Louis at one time was called Mound City. The only thing that's left of the Great Mound is the street they call the Great Mound. It was demolished to
St. Louis.
build the riverfront. But there are other mounds there. Our tribe just bought a half of a mound in downtown St. Louis called Sugarloaf Mound. Half of it was destroyed for mining, but there's a house on top of it now. And somebody lived up there, kind of like Monk's Mound there in Cahokia. But there are suburbs all up and down the river, even as far west as Columbia, Missouri, and Jeff City. The state capitol was built on a mound, the Missouri State Capitol, and so it really spans a great length, and it was like it wasn't just a city, it was a trade network. So there's stuff from the West Coast, the East Coast, Gulf of Mexico, mica from the Great Lakes was found there. So tribes didn't necessarily have to go to California, they just had to make it to Cahokia.
Pipestone.
By the Yeah, and by the way, I mentioned this Honors Forum Causes and Consequences of Ecosystems Collapse. Ed has agreed to be one of my guest speakers, and by the way, it's Honors Forum, but it's open broadly to, it prioritizes enrollment with honor students, but it will be open to a broader audience, and you'll hear more from Ed because Cahokia happens to be a site of interest and research from him, so we've had some conversations, and I look forward to hearing his discussions in that forum as well. So any other thoughts or questions? How many of you are inspired to go to these sites that you haven't been? Awesome. So as I said in my first talk, I think I missed my calling as a tour guide. So I get to live vicariously through these opportunities and make my presentations and share my stories, and in this case share my brochure. So hopefully it inspires and informs you beyond this hour we've spent together. But again, don't hesitate. Pick up a business card. Call me, email me. I enjoy that follow-up thought process too. Thank you.